Like I promised last week, there was a section on brain and arousal and then senses and arousal, and I didn't get to that from last week. So I wanted to start with that today, and it shouldn't take about 15 minutes or so to get through that, and then we can get to gender. So this is picking up from last week. The brain and sexual arousal. So a lot of this, and we'll see in a couple other slides, a lot of different experiments that have happened, studies where you put people in like an fMRI machine and then expose them to different sexual stimuli, things like that, to just see if we can like locate a specific part of the brain or particular neurotransmitter, or like we're just trying to find the most like basic information on the brain and sexual arousal sort of thing. So as of right now, a lot of people, a lot of biologists, neurobiologists believe that the more the things like fantasy and what may arouse one person in particular very much could be influenced by the whole cerebral cortex. So not much differentiation there, just the whole cerebral cortex may be responsible for each individual person's idiosyncratic level of arousal to whatever it may be that they are aroused to. So interpretation, like is this a safe situation, unsafe situation, like things that you have to think through. That's where we would be looking at influence arousal, the cerebral cortex. So they've seen that there's a high amount of activity within the cerebral cortex when asking people to engage in sexual fantasy. And the limbic system. I think that it's safe to say that we're a little more specific about what we know as far as the limbic system. So the limbic system is generally, I'll show you a better picture, but generally, around right here, often called the reptilian part of our brain, because a lot of those structures you can find in animals like reptiles. So the limbic system, we'll go over what each structure within the limbic system is in a second. So neurotransmitters that have been really of interest to neurobiologists who study sexual arousal is dopamine and serotonin. I bet that most of you have already heard of dopamine and serotonin. So read this clearly. So dopamine facilitates sexual arousal and activity. So the easiest way to remember this would be, the more and more dopamine, the more and more likely someone is going to be sexually aroused and lead to activity. As far as serotonin, the more and more serotonin that you pump through someone's brain, that tends to inhibit sexual arousal. So you have those two. You have dopamine that really increases things, and then serotonin that decreases things. And as far as like some more specific findings, so just looking at, getting men, put them in an fMRI machine or some other machine that measures brain activity, get them to masturbate, and then at the point of ejaculation, that around that time frame, really honing in on the brain and seeing what happens there, with some theory and whatnot, but sometimes not. Sometimes they just kind of see what happens. So we're really interested in this medial preoptic area. So that is right here, right there, and is shown to reduce sex drive. So activation of the medial preoptic area, the more blood flow that goes to there, the more active that it is, the less someone is probably sexually aroused. So we found found a little area that really has to do with arousal, at least for men. And then, so I think a lot of you may be familiar with SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and that is given to a lot of people who suffer from depression. And it's great because it helps a lot of people with depression, with their mood and whatnot. So that's great. However, one of the main side effects of psychotropic medication in general, but especially SSRIs, is that it can reduce the sex drive. So that makes sense because SSRIs increase the serotonin, active serotonin. We won't go into that, but basically increase the serotonin that's going throughout the brain. And as we know, if you increase the serotonin, the sex drive goes down. So that's the explanation on why SSRIs have the side effect of sexual arousal being diminished. And then dopamine, like we talked about before. So we see dopamine in the medial preoptic area here. We see that increasing sex drive. So we've kind of located one of the areas of the brain that's primarily responsible for sexual arousal, facilitating sexual arousal and not arousal. So let's go through the limbic system, the structures in the limbic system that all have to do, there's a coordinated effort with the whole brain for the sexual response, physiological sexual response, but especially the limbic system, most specifically the MPOA, but a little more broadly than that, the limbic system. So we got the cingulate gyrus, amygdala here, hippocampus, it's generally associated with memories and things, and part of the hypothalamus here. All these are active during sexual arousal. And as we saw, that MPOA is part of the hypothalamus. Let's go back again. So the medial preoptic area right here is part of the hypothalamus, tied to arousal and ultimately behavior. So electrical stimulation to the hypothalamus right here, and especially the MPOA, increases arousal. So you can do this even just with like an electrical stimulation can actually make someone, go through the process of some vasocongestion in their genitals, which is interesting. And interesting as well, elimination of this area, MPOA and or the hypothalamus, we'll just focus on the MPOA. Elimination of this area usually either at least reduces one's sex drive and or eliminates sex drive altogether. So we're fairly confident that the MPOA is very responsible for sexual arousal. So a little bit more into fMRI and brain imaging. As far as sexual arousal goes, how do they know that all these specific parts of the brain are active during arousal? Well, they, fMRIs at least, detect blood flow to that area. So when there's a influx of blood flow into a particular area, that gives different colors and whatnot on the for the scientists to be able to see where the blood flow acceleration is going to in the brain. And so when we see that blood flow going to that the hypothalamus and the MPOA, see it's even around this area still, we know that that's tied with sexual arousal. So you can see, so you have someone go into one of these machines, expose them, either have them engage in sexual fantasy themselves in their own minds, or expose them to images that they find arousing and whatnot, and then they see they're looking in real time at this activation of this area. So you see, it may be something that a scientist would see, a whole lot of accelerated activity going on right here, if you can see my cursor, and then lo and behold, they, if it's a man, start getting an erection, and women start having lubrication and general vasocongestion in the vulva area. Detects increased neuron firing, and so it's not just blood flow that's necessarily being analyzed here, it's also increased activity in general. So Karama, and I'm sure that person is not the last, in 2002 had people go into fMRIs, showed them pornography, and then the limbic system had the most increased activity, as we've already been talking about, and especially the amygdala. Hold on, let me go back. So amygdala, hypothalamus are both influential as far as sexual arousal goes. And hypothalamus and cingulate gyrus are also involved. So of course it's more complicated than just the MPOA that's being activated. There's a whole orchestration going on. But I mostly want you guys just to focus on, for testing and whatnot, just the MPOA. All right, the senses and sexual arousal. Not much research. It seems like observational type research has been done on this. It's not like they get people together and just try to stimulate each other by different sounds, and then they say, oh, well, the hearing, if you hear X, Y, or Z, then all humans get aroused. Once we get into things that are more idiosyncratic, by and large, in a way, it's harder to make general conclusions like that. So all the sensory systems that we just looked at can contribute to arousal. Touch can, sight can, smell can, hearing can, taste can, all contribute to sexual arousal. But touch tends to predominate. So places obviously like one's genitals, buttocks, anus, perineum, so that, I don't think we've gone over this, but the space between the anus and the genitals around there, and breast, nipples, those are the primary erogenous zones that tend to arouse the general person most of the time, depending on who they're with, of course, too. So the explanation behind this is the dense concentration of nerve endings in those particular areas, especially like your genitals. So what's known as a secondary erogenous zones it's more idiosyncratic. So depending on the person, they may be aroused. A particular person may be aroused by a lot of touch to their neck or earlobes, or people talk about toes and things like that. And so the theory is that those sort of things are due to social conditioning. So per each individual, they may have learned throughout their history that those are sexual areas, the earlobes or toes or whatever, I don't know. And they get aroused by that, and it's possible that they may get aroused even more than being stimulated from the primary erogenous zones. So touch tends to predominate as the most likely sense to get a person aroused. Vision tends to be the second dominant sense. And Kinsey, when he did his interviews with men and women, he tended to see that men self-report higher arousal to visual stimuli. So smell can either arouse someone, or it could also put someone off as well. I think we talked about this just a little bit last time. I fast forwarded to this. Women tend to emit pheromones during fertile periods, like we've talked about before. And then people have receptive sites in their olfactory system, their nose system, olfactory system, like the VNO and the olfactory epithelium, the OE. So these receptive sites are like we have predisposed, you could say, to smelling when a woman is most fertile, and this can lead to arousal, smelling these pheromones. Genital secretions turn some people on, turn some people off. Not much research on that in particular. So smell, we did vision, touch. Taste seems to play a minor role compared to vision and touch as far as the senses go. Semen or vaginal secretions, tasting those may increase arousal, possibly, depending on the person. And then hearing kind of plays a variable role as well. So some people lack the confidence to emit spontaneous auditory expressions of arousal orgasm. Not sure why I put that there exactly, but just saying that, hearing someone being sexually aroused and having those sort of sounds may very well arouse the person who's hearing it, as you can imagine. All right, so now we are getting to the gender issues. So your chapter 5, and we're kind of starting from the beginning, like where I'm going to start in like 2 seconds is pretty much where chapter 5 begins. So let's talk about sex and gender, just the very basics, and then we'll get more nuanced with our thoughts on this. So as far as anatomical sex, 99% about 99% of the time, doctors and nurses will say, oh yes, that's a boy, oh yes, that's a girl, based on their genitals and their anatomy. Next week we'll talk more about intersex issues and things like that. Today mostly focusing on as far as anatomy goes, men and women and gender as well. And so that would be one's sex assigned at birth. So what is gender? There are a plethora of theories on what gender is. Like I said, we'll get more nuanced as we go. But one way of understanding gender is that it pertains to masculinity and femininity. So gender is masculinity and femininity. Masculinity, as many people think of that, like what would that mean? It would be things like being strong and whatnot, emotionally and physically. Femininity, more with grace and caretaking and things. Just kind of the stereotypes. And of course, most people associate this masculinity throughout time with men. So people born with male genitalia usually associate them as being more masculine and teach them to be more masculine and expect them to be more masculine and all these sort of things throughout a person's development. Expect them to be strong in different ways. We'll definitely get deeper on what masculinity could mean and femininity could mean beyond strong and graceful. And the same thing for people who had female genitalia. Women typically seen as you're supposed to be feminine, so graceful, congenial, and things like that. And with activities such as caregiving and just being caring in general, things like that. So there always seemed to be this dichotomy. It's yes, we see biologically you got 1, 2, it's male, female, okay, and then somewhere in the mix, people were well, the humans with the penis, they need to be masculine throughout their life, and those people with vulvas, vaginas, female sexual anatomy, they need to be feminine throughout their lives. And so that's kind of where we're at with that right now. So gender identity. So this is just the subjective sense of your gender. Do you feel more masculine most of the time? Or do you feel more feminine most of the time? And it's just your subjective sense. If anyone were to look at you, they wouldn't know what your gender identity is, because it's determined by and felt by you and only you. Of course, you can communicate what your gender identity is to other people and whatnot, but that's basically it as far as that goes. So psychological attributes, kind of like we're talking about, being strong versus being graceful and caring. Your gender identity, if you kind of think that you may identify as a man, if you really tend to value being strong, especially above and beyond all the other psychological characteristics that one could have. Or if you really associate with being graceful and a host and things like that, then you may identify with being a woman. And then we'll get into transgender issues next week. So the gender expression, things like hairstyle and whether someone is out working in the world, especially like in mechanics and things like that. People outwardly express their gender, Mechanics, they definitely need to be strong and whatnot, so that's a man that's doing that sort of thing. Or has a dress on and is much more about social engagements and things like that. Well, then, their gender expression is a woman. Now, we don't know what sort of anatomy each person has based on their gender expression, but typically, we'll leave the ambiguity of this this topic for next week, but just your general information on that. Yeah, expression as a man or expression as a woman. How do you live in the world? That could be another way to say it. And we will get deeper on that today. So let's go through some of the history of the research with gender and psychology. I think that'll be one of the good places to start. All right, let us pick up on Chapter 5, Issues, Gender and Psychology. I'm going to have about 5 or 6 slides kind of going through the history of the first psychologists. I think we'll get to some of sociology of what the studies were like and the questions they were asking were like when gender was first studied. Gender as being male, female, masculine, feminine. So one of the overarching questions that was so interesting to people at the time, and it's like, well, with science, can we determine that women are feminine and men are masculine? So let's split these two. Let's get a whole lot of men, let's get a whole lot of women, and then study each one and see, oh yeah, all the men, they are more masculine. All the women, they are more feminine. So it's kind of pretty basic like that at the beginning. They, a little bit more specifically than that, they investigated traits, abilities. So it wasn't necessarily just all psychological. It could be abilities as well. So taking care of children or mathematical abilities, different abilities like that. Kind of, like I said, taking the men and women and then testing and then seeing if there's a difference between the two. Everyone just really wanted there to be a very big difference in the psychological makeup of men and women, and they were determined to find it. And so emotions as well. All sorts of variety of emotions, and I'm sure mostly what they just asked was, like a self-report sort of thing on, I've been feeling sad recently, I agree, I disagree, that sort of stuff, to just really want to establish that men and women are in fact different from each other inherently. So what psychologists have really been interested in, and they're like, hey, since we know men and women are definitely different psychologically from each other, look at their biology. Their sexual anatomy is definitely different for the average man versus the average woman. So, it must be, within the brain, within the physiology, just within the biology that will lead us to this answer of men are different from women. So they looked at different. So this is what you can find, the synopsis, which is a decent, synopsis in our book on chapter 5 on gender, on hormonal differences generally found between men and women, different neurochemical differences found between men and women, how the brain structure is different between men and women, things like that. For instance, when I was a undergrad, we talked about how the corpus callosum, the structure that's in between the left and the right hemisphere of the brain, that it's denser in women than men. And it's like, okay, well, that's interesting. And so they, leaps and bounds of logic. They're like, well, that's probably, why women can multitask better and stuff like that. So some pretty precarious sort of conclusions. So what's really important here is that because they saw the obvious anatomical difference between men and women, and they went looking for hormonal differences, neurochemical differences, any sort of difference, like I just said, like about the corpus callosum in a brain, they're like, well, that explains why men are masculine and women are feminine. And so this is what many would say is a reductionistic explanation. Just because someone's biology may be a little bit different doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to end up a certain way. So let's talk about a little bit more of what I mean by that. So just because it's a reductionistic explanation, just because what's happening on a physiological level doesn't mean that there are differences on a psychological level, so much so. Really, it could have just stayed within biology and not really made its way to psychology. But the psychologists kind of used those sort of biological differences. So in a lot of these, as far as the research on gender and everything, historically it was to understand gender itself, researchers were mostly just using one very specific demographic, like just young men, just white men, and just college students, in order to make explanations about gender at large. Not really sure how that was supposed to work, and that is one of the big flaws from the beginning of the research, was that it was just primarily a very specific demographic, and they were trying to make generalizations to gender at large, when, one flaw would be that they're only studying men. And rightly so, feminist psychologists criticize this as androcentric. So just centered around men. It's like, well, maybe we did find out what it's like to be a young white man, college man. Those original studies might have been have some insight into that and maybe their masculinity and whatnot, but doesn't really say much about the rest of the world. So I like this point, and you'll find this mostly in a lot of sociological explanations. So this will be in the book chapter that I have you reading. So gender expression as actually gender itself. So you may hear this as doing gender. So it's not like you're masculine because your anatomy is male. It's like if you express yourself as masculine, then that would be your gender. If you express yourself as feminine, then that would be your gender. So not based on like the anatomical sexual anatomy is basically irrelevant. So one of the first people to really give a good, you can look this up if you want to. I read through this a little bit, and it's pretty good. Candace West and Don Zimmerman talking about, what does it mean to do gender, as gender expression is kind of action, what you do. And Judith Butler we'll talk about later as one of the philosophical psychologists who talks about, I believe it is queer theory, that she thinks along with the same lines, that doing gender is really what our gender is, our gender expression. And it's important to note, so we'll talk about gender nonconforming, non-binary, gender fluid type stuff next week, but it's important to note here that you can do gender by not conforming to either side, by doing both genders, or not doing any, gender at all as a possibility. So the behavior becomes the proof. So this is a quote, I think, from the Candace West and Don Zimmerman article. The behavior becomes proof to the actor as well as to the onlookers that this is what it means to be a man or a woman. So based on their behavior, as opposed to based on whether a particular person is acting masculine or acting feminine, rather than their anatomical genitalia. So, femininity. What is it generally associated with? I've mentioned a few things. So caring, so actual caregiving, and compassion, and empathy, empathizing with people, showing that you're empathizing, connecting with people, a lot of social type stuff, listening kind of goes along with all that. And then some other things like being passive as opposed to setting the rules, or leading in a significant capacity and whatnot. These are some of the things that people typically associate with femininity. And so Curie is a researcher who holds that femininity is located in the interactions and actions, kind of like what we were talking about before with doing gender, not in the minds or bodies of individual women. So that's an interesting idea. So same argument for masculinity is defined as the repertoire of actions and characteristics. So being brusque and confident and all those sort of things, being leaders and all that sort of thing. You could all boil that down to and call that masculinity. So what I want you to do now for me, you're not going to turn this in, but take out a piece of paper, if you will. I think this is a pretty cool exercise. And take the paper and divide it, and put women in one column, and then men into another column. Then list like about 10 or 15 attributes that describe each. So you can start with women, and then I'll write a few here for myself. And kind of think about these as like, you know, what is the characteristics, the stereotypical characteristics of a woman, a stereotypical characteristic of a man. And you can pause it here to give yourself some more time. Really try to get it out to at least like 10 or 15 attributes, you say, psychological attributes to both sexes. Then, once you've done that, go and look at each one and put a plus by the ones that are the attributes that are generally positive in our society, and do a negative next to the ones that are typically considered not as undesirable in our society. And a lot of times what we'll come to is that on the women's side, there is, so like more associated with femininity, there's a bit more minuses that we have. So some people stereotype women or femininity as being weak. So that would be one of the negatives. And then we see in the men's column, like leaders and energetic and all this sort of stuff, by and large, a little more positive. So we'll talk about gender inequality more at the beginning of next week, but this kind of just starts us in that direction as seeing, this is kind of an exercise that's supposed to illustrate how in our society women are have a harder time showing their what they're worth than men. You know, possible explanation there because of how femininity, how masculinity is regarded as superior in many people's minds than to femininity. So we'll come back to that exercise and talk a little bit more about that next week with the gender inequality stuff. So gender role expectations. How does society expect you to operate in society based on your gender? Hold on real quick. I'll be back. Okay, and we're back. So gender role expectations. How society expects you to act and be based on whether they perceive you as being masculine or feminine, a man or a woman. So we've already talked about this a little bit. Societal expectations for females is that they be more into caretaking, things like that. You know, writing maybe something that's a little more, maybe a little bit more of a newer type stereotype, saying that women have better verbal skills than men and things like that. So that could be a stereotype or expectation of people, that women have a easier time learning to write and have higher expectations on their writing and things like that. And you can, you know, list off a lot of other societal expectations that are attributed mostly to females rather than males. And the expectation that a lot of society puts on women is that they develop these feminine abilities, you know, mostly based on their sex at birth. So society, not saying that females should adhere to these feminine abilities, but society tends to give females more opportunities to master these abilities we're talking about. So hold on real quick. I'll make that point more clear in a second. Society tends to grant more social rewards for mastery as well. So as far as, let's go back up to the opportunities. So opportunities to master said abilities. So let's think about babysitting. Almost all babysitters are female. They're given more opportunities to practice this caregiving ability than boys, men are. That's one example. And then kind of the same thing as far as social rewards. So a woman who is doing, let's bring it to maybe girls. So girls playing house and whatnot, and maybe the mother of this daughter goes over and is very excited that she's playing house and doing things with teapots and whatnot. And so the child gets a lot of attention, which she really wanted, just wanted attention from mom, but when she's doing this very specific thing of being feminine. So how say whether females inherently specialize to master feminine skills? Scratch that, I'm not sure what I meant by that. So same for men or boys. So for sports, so like you said, like I said, we have a boy who starts to engage in sports, and then, you know, that kid really wanted attention, and lo and behold, he starts doing sports and activities like that, and then dad comes in and shows him a lot of attention, even teaches him different sport techniques and all this sort of stuff, so they get attention for being masculine. So what about our sexual experience can be different based on our gender? So, hold on real quick. So questions like who initiates the dating and sexual, who puts the moves on first. Let's say this is a female who's attracted to this male and he's attracted to her, and they have in their minds, you know, they may want to be sexual with each other in some way. So this gender role expectation generally in our society overall, I mean, I think this is changing, and we'll talk about that point later. but thinking, is it more appropriate for the man to initiate the sexual overtures, or and then the woman should say, no, I don't want to do that, or yeah, let's do that? Is it like how it's supposed to go? Or can it not be reversed? Can the woman not initiate sex and whatnot? And I know from studies that a lot of women, and there's some women in your book who talk about hesitating to initiate because they may not want to be seen as like oversexed or something like that. So it's kind of a dilemma there a little bit. So once you're actually engaging in sexual activity with someone, let's say, again, for example, it's a man and a woman engaging in sexual activity, a question that may be on their minds is like, how active should I be during this? Should I be more of the receiver of pleasure or the giver of pleasure? And many men in our society are given the idea that they are the ones who are doing most of the pleasing and stuff like that, and the women be receiving. And of course, that's not how it has to be, but maybe just a general expectation on that. So the general societal general expectations can, change how we are as sexual beings, and in relationships as well. So expectations that we have for our intimate relationships or our romantic relationships, is it just generally assumed that men, let's say this is a married couple, man and woman, does the man make the money? So these are just sort of expectations, that would be good to be talked through rather than assumptions. So more kind of sexual scripts, let's think about in terms of man and a woman having sex. The baseball analogy is like a lot of men grow up thinking and talking about, I don't know why they would relate sexuality or the sexual experience to baseball, but as in first base, second base, third base, home run being, I guess, intercourse, first base being something like kissing, things like that. Like the sexual script for boys is that you're supposed to go to first base first, then second, third, fourth, and you're supposed to do it that way. And so it's very like the boy is supposed to be doing these things to the girl. So these are just expectations that are out there in society. So there's a script, and a lot of the studies that determine this sort of thing. So script that men have high sex drive. So Borodini and Sperb, they're not just this is not an anomaly. There are plenty of other people who research this as well. They will get men and women participants and then ask them to talk about what their expectations are as far as sex drive for men and for women. And by and large, most, at least in 2013, most of the people who responded to the research said that, men have high sex drives and women don't have high sex drives. Now, what we already know, we've talked a lot about physiology and arousal and whatnot. We know that that's not the case, but these are just the expectations or the script, kind of like like a theater script. You're supposed to go by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're supposed to act a certain way because society says so, sort of thing. Women are undersexual. That's just another way to say what I just said a second ago. So a lot of women are taught to deny their sexual urges. They want to appear as though they're not super sexually aroused because that's like for the man sort of thing. The man's supposed to be super sexually aroused and put on all the moves and whatnot. And my sexual urges, I don't really have them. And many women being taught that it's not appropriate to be easily aroused, which obviously could result in things like shame and then not initiating sexual overtures with a boy or man. And then, men in a way can be harmed by this stereotype of being overly sexual. Their partner possibly, this is from your book, may possibly feel, like they don't know for sure whether the man likes them or not because he didn't get erect really quickly or something like that. So like the stereotype that men should be quick to arouse as opposed to, well, no, some men, a lot of men, it takes a little bit more stimulation to get aroused, doesn't necessarily have any bearing on the attraction level that he has towards her and whatnot. So that stereotype that they're revved and ready to go can be, harmful to men in relationships. So this is kind of more of the same. Men as initiators, women as receivers. And this can go for the actual relationship itself. So, who typically may ask people out on a first date first? Is it mostly men who ask the woman out in just hetero sexual relationships? Is it the man who asks the woman out, or is it typically the woman who asks the men out? Now, I think those trends are probably changing, at least in some way, but as far as general societal expectations on men and women is that men initiate things like the first date. And then even sexual activity, so man and woman back at their house alone on the couch, it's kind of expected that the man will initiate the sexual activity because, remember, he's supposed to be super horny, so of course he's going to initiate. And then the women are supposed to receive this and either say, no, I don't want to, or yes, let's do this. And so you can see that this script can be very constraining to someone who may not want to act within that script. All right, there was a quote I wanted to read in our book. All right, page 148. At the bottom, this is a woman, I believe. I like to ask men out, and I have often done so. But it's frustrating when many of the men I ask out automatically assume I want to jump in bed with them because I take the initiative to make a date. It's hard for me to let my man know what I like during lovemaking. After all, he's supposed to know, isn't he? If I tell him, it's like I'm usurping his role as the all-knowing one. So you can see that may be potentially damaging to some relationships. All these unsaid expectations and whatnot just based on how things have gone historically. Yeah, we've kind of talked about that, women as the controllers of the sexual intercourse. So the script is that men are definitely revved and ready to go, and then women, because their sexual desire is lower, which we know is not necessarily the case, they are the ones who are in control of saying, how far they go within the sexual activity. So this is a problem. Men seeing women as sexual challenges. This is another sort of thing that if you're a person in the society, you've probably come across this, I'm sure, in one way or another, that men may or may not be so interested in like connecting intimately with a female partner, but thinking more about themselves, and they're like, well, I want to feel good about themselves, maybe on some sort of subconscious level. And they're like, the way to be the most manly, and being manly is good, is that I have sex with as many women as possible. And if I have sex with 20 women this week, then that means that I'm the best man in the world. And that's probably, I'm the best person in the world, sort of thing. Seeing women as sexual challenges. So getting into this sort of rut, a lot of men are socialized to be that way. First it's good to bring awareness to that, you're doing that sort of pattern and whatnot, and reflect on whether that's how you actually want to be in the world and whatnot. And getting in that sort of pattern as seeing women as sexual challenges could really hurt intimacy, as you would imagine. The man's thinking about basically penetration and or orgasm with this one woman, and then already thinking about other people shortly after that. And that takes away the whole thing of like emotional intimacy. So for these men who have been socialized this way and are not so self-reflective and whatnot, then they may have difficulty really just appreciating the feelings of being close to someone, touching them, being with them, and whatnot. Always thinking of, like I said, the overture, the penetration, orgasm, and get on to the next person. Definitely not mindful. Difficulty being receptive. So this type of man that we're talking about, what if he were just to lie in the bed or wherever this imaginary male-female couple is? Maybe they're out in the woods, I don't know. He's laying down. Remember, he's this macho man, and his partner just wants him to lay there and receive pleasure. And this may be challenging for him because he thinks that he's so consumed with, being a manly man and all this sort of stuff that it's difficult for him to kind of be vulnerable in this situation. So more gender role expectations, that men are unemotional and strong. So kind of like what we were talking about just a second ago, men may be hesitant or just because they've been socialized this way are just not good at expressing deep feelings and vulnerabilities and stuff like that. So they really may not be all that well equipped to engage in a deep, meaningful, emotional sort of relationship and whatnot. So that gender stereotype that men don't express themselves emotionally, especially if they're sad or afraid and things like that. can't be tender, receptive, can't be nurturing, caring, compassionate. You can obviously see how not having all these qualities that are typically associated with women, or not having some feminine qualities like this, would wreak havoc on a relationship. These men thinking that being emotional, being emotionally expressive, being tender and vulnerable and or caring is just for women. Obviously, we can see how damaging that is. Yeah, kind of already explained that already. Men who want to be perceived as strong may have a challenge expressing any sort of vulnerability. And if you can't express any vulnerabilities in a romantic relationship, not sure how much intimacy you can achieve. So what does that do to our romantic relationships between men and women? Well, if to the man and woman who's been taught to behave in a certain way all their lives, and are not very reflective, and it may not be that great of a relationship until both of them can be open with each other. So a man who's supposed to be unemotional and strong, how might this man approach sex? Kind of like we talked about before, just a sexual prowess. Let's get to the erection, let's get to the penetration, orgasm, and then basically on to the next thing. So this man who sees himself, whether consciously or subconsciously, as unemotional and strong, may approach sex in this way. And so, sometimes people like to just have a very quick encounter that is all about penetration and orgasm, and but if they've communicated that and are able to do other things that they like physically, then that may have depends on the context. If there's no communication and this is the way that the man goes into sex with this woman, probably not going to lead to the most sexual satisfaction, at least for this woman in this circumstance. And so I keep harping on this, that you have the very typical man may be very inept at things like intimacy and closeness, because they think being vulnerable and open and emotional is bad because they're sexist. Hold on real quick. Okay, gender role expectations. Women as nurturing and supportive. Those are the stereotypes. So they may feel responsible. Like if you're in this kind of situation, women may, feel really responsible to start getting their man to talk about their feelings and whatnot, because, they're the caring and responsive one and things like that. And obviously if you have one person who's really trying to get deeper into a relationship with another person and they just keep hitting a brick wall, what does that really probably say about their sexual satisfaction and relationship satisfaction with this person if they keep on and keep on and keep on trying to crack this nut open? like, that's not very good, fun. So hopefully, we kind of want to see this equal exchange of vulnerability and things like that as far as sexual satisfaction and relationship satisfaction.